Okay, welcome everybody. This is an extra panel session here today, and welcome everyone to this special panel session. And we're going to be talking about demystifying procurement in the NHS. And the panellists here today, who many of you may know, will be discussing shared ambitions for NHS procurement, including how the commercial function of the NHS can drive greater value for taxpayers, deliver patient outcomes, and importantly, support the NHS with its net zero ambitions. We're also going to discuss the development of the NHS commercial function and how the NHS can work with its suppliers. Joining me today are Jackie Rock, CCO NHS England, Priya Bailey, Director of Procurement Transformation NHS England and NHS Improvement, and Pia Larson, Director of Procurement and Supply Chain, UCLH. Turning first to you, Jackie, why are you demystifying procurement?
Okay, well, thanks very much, and thank you for all turning up when I know we've been given quite an interesting slot and actually everyone else is getting their lunch. So we thank you for being here today, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion in terms of the NHS. So I think the reason that we wanted to do this discussion today, and myself, Priya and Pia, is it's really complex, right? Actually, all procuring with government is complex. I was, previous to this, I was in the Ministry of Defence. That was complex. The NHS is even more so. When you look at our the diversity of what we have, we've got over 80,000 suppliers that supply into the NHS. We've got over 4,000 people buying things in the NHS, over 300 commercial teams, and they're all split into different kind of organisations. So you've got big national procurements that Priya and her team look after. You've got all the procurements that are done out of the trusts and the ICSs, which Pia will be able to talk to. You've got a lot of procurement that's done still through Crown Commercial Services for our common goods and services. You've got a lot of procurement that is done through the NHS supply chain, and I could go on. It's really, really complicated. It's complicated for suppliers to know how on earth where to go, and it's actually very complicated for us in the NHS as well in terms of buying platforms. So those are some of the conversations we want to have today, and really would appreciate the feedback from the audience as well.
So be prepared. And Priya, why don't you give us an overview of where you are in this as well?
So I think a number of people come to us and talk about the One NHS, and we absolutely are the One in NHS in terms of our goals and our ambitions around supplying patient care. But we are also a few hundred different organisations that make up the NHS. And what we're trying to do is actually make that a lot clearer for suppliers. When we start to look at innovation, so as we come into the NHS, if suppliers have got clear innovative products that we want to take forward in the NHS, we want to pull together one single route, so it's really clear for suppliers where you come through with the NHS. We're also looking at different clinical voices at the moment, because yes, every clinician has their preference. It's how do we bring together those clinical voices, and so there, again, there's a really clear direction. And how do we make it transparent for suppliers about what we want to buy? There are a number of areas. We're looking at our specifications. I think if you look up, there's a Boardman review, and that was really around the lessons learned from COVID, around the NHS needs to start to publish the specifications around the things that we want to buy. So it's really clear for suppliers where you're able to go to one place to look at the specifications and understand, does your product meet that specifications? Government is also looking at our pipelines. So at the moment, as soon as we've awarded a contract, every NHS organisation and even government organisation has to publish those contracts. But what we want to do now is get on the front foot of that, and this year for all NHS organisations to start to publish our procurement pipelines ahead. So what that will allow suppliers is to go to an NHS Trust website to see these are the things that we're going to buy, and these are some of the timelines that we're going to buy it, which allows suppliers to start to get prepared. It also allows NHS England, as we look across all of the different trusts when they're going out to market, is how can we start to time those procurements, so we're not all going to the market at the same time for the same thing, but actually looking at that in a really measured way going forward.
And Pia, demystifying procurement, why is that essential?
I mean, working in a large NHS trust, we we're responsible for a huge range of goods and services across some very large organisations. And I suppose we are working in a landscape where we're facing some of the most challenging financial circumstances that the NHS has faced for some time, despite all the sort of press. And what that means is there's a real imperative for us to move away from cost and start to look at value. And I think that's a really significant shift that we need to be working with industry on. And we need to, there's also the sort of, the policy landscape around working across trusts within ICSs or ICBs or STPs, whichever their sort of namesakes are in the current climate, and starting to think about, well, actually, working at a trust level is still very complex, but you then go cross-border into multiple trust procurements and multiple sort of incoming supply chains, and you're facing very, very complex arrangements. And engaging with our clinical teams to come to those joint decisions or joint procurements is even more challenging than it is just with your group of clinicians in your local trust. So we've got the financial challenge that is sort of, extremely acute. We're coming out of COVID, that the elective recovery agenda is at the forefront of all trusts in terms of our planning horizon. And, we are, absolutely going to need to be able to deliver that elective backlog through, increased efficiencies and really working with suppliers to say, well, we haven't got the money to sort of do things unless we can really demonstrate the value. So, there's no excess in the system, and we've really got to optimise what we're doing to deliver the backlog across the NHS.
And how difficult is it to, how do you quantify value? Because cost is something that's very easy to measure, right? Whereas value is a little bit more ambiguous. So how do you ensure you are getting that value?
Well, I think you have to look across the whole patient pathway. So, there's this whole concept of the value chain, is one well known to us in the sort of supply chain landscape. And we've got to, if we were only continue to be focused on costs, we're going to run into some significant problems. You end up buying twice or 3 times in some instances, and the value can be in non-financial measurement. Mm-hmm. So we might be looking at things like reduced bed stay, we might be looking at things like reduced surgical site infections, we might be looking at how to deliver surgical cases in a shorter period of time. How do we invest to take out longer term costs? How do we deliver better patient outcomes which deliver that value to our patients and across the system? And that's that value proposition, if you like, is one that should not be entirely cost driven.
Yep.
There's always a cost clearly to be thought about, but it can't be fundamentally cost driven.
You were clearly agreeing with that, Jackie. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're all passionate. When you think about it, we're the largest spender of public money, the NHS, across all of Her Majesty's government. And you would have all felt it in your pay packets this month, because we're all now paying more national insurance to ensure that we're putting the money in the right place within our healthcare system. So, as commercial leaders as well, and identifying where that value is our responsibility to make sure that we are giving that value to the taxpayer in terms of how we're spending that money. But again, it is all about, we are the NHS, it is always all about patient outcome. And how do we do effective procurement? How do we do effective leveraging of our spend, working with our suppliers, so that everything we do always comes down to how does that impact the patient? How does that impact the patient pathway? It's about 35 billion of addressable spend that we're responsible for. It's a lot of money, and we have to be very, very careful and clear how we spend that going forward. And some of you would have heard me speak before in terms of test and trace, and obviously, you know, there are other people that in our teams that could talk about the vaccines or PPE in other areas, and we've had a really interesting last 2 years in terms of government spend on the pandemic, and it's a really, really imperative now, and one of our key focuses is we take a breath. We've done what we've done on the pandemic, and we're still obviously reacting to COVID, but now it's kind of what do we do going forward, and how do we reset and re-baseline and ensure that every single penny of taxpayers' money is adding value to the NHS and patient outcome.
Okay.
Scott, if I can add, just around, so Pia mentioned around the ICSs, the integrated care systems, and that's really how the NHS starts to work much closer with local authorities. And when you start to think about those two organisations coming together is what we describe as anchor institutions. They can really support local communities. And a lot of especially some of the bigger cities are talking about what does it mean for their local pound. So you hear reference around the Leeds pound or the London pound. And when we start to think about what commercial can do, when we start to look at our contracts, it isn't only purely now about the cost. Pierre mentioned quality. You know, we've been hit hard with certain areas where, yes, we have driven down the cost, but actually the quality of those products hasn't been fit for purpose. And so we do need to more and more look at the quality as well as the cost, and also look at how we're supporting local employment. That's a really big driver. Part of coming out of the COVID pandemic has been looking around UK Make, looking at our supplier resilience, and we're seeing more and more with suppliers where, you know, previously it was a real push towards lean because that was really the way around keeping our production lines smaller and more efficient. But we're starting to see more investment back into the UK in order to build up that supplier resilience and therefore supporting some of that local economy. And Jackie's going to speak later around social value and sustainability. And again, a really good opportunity there around starting to look at that wider environmental impact as well as part of that value back to the NHS.
Yeah, I want to come back to that that environmental impact and, you know, sustainability issues. How are you working towards a net zero health service and embedding sustainability into that procurement?
Well, that's my advertisement for my keynote speech on the main stage at 2:30 this afternoon. But actually, I'll let Pia and Priya answer that so that I don't pick the same things. Because, you know, slightly from a... Because, you know, we've done, it's incredibly important. Go ahead.
So if I talk a little bit from a policy side and then Pia can talk from a on-the-ground side. So you would have seen we've published our net zero roadmap, and what Jackie will take you through later on is sort of the different milestones within that. And that's how the NHS is going to get to net zero by 2045. And 2045 feels quite far away. We'll probably all be retired by then. But actually 2010 is a big milestone on that plan, because by 2010 the NHS will no longer work with suppliers who are not aligned with our ambitions. And actually UCLH Hospital, where Pia is the Director of Procurement, was the first trust who said that they would be net zero by 2010, and actually a number of trusts have after that. 2010. 2010. A number of trusts after that have also started following suit around putting 2010 as the date when they would be. Not 2010. 2030. Sorry.
That's all right, Priya.
2030.
That's 20 years of our life.
We'll stop that part.
That's fine.
By 2030, I meant within the next 10 years, when we first announced it in 2010. So by 2030 to be net zero, so UCLH was the first trust, and a number of trusts then have said the same. But to get there, especially the way the NHS around how we procure our goods. And so for this year, from the 1st of April, every NHS organisation is starting to include a 10% weighting in all their procurements for social value. And what my team is doing is working with every NHS organisation around that we ask the right questions as part of that social value 10%. So it has to be relevant, absolutely, to what we're buying, but ensuring we're starting to share best practice across the piece. And we've also just published our social value guidance, again, which suppliers, you'll be able to go onto our website and see, which is around how we're going to get to that 2030 and then 2045 deadline as well. But to support that around innovation, last year, and we're planning to do the same again this year, is around an innovation fund which will support where suppliers are coming up with new products. So we've just announced those winners, and I think Jackie's got a few of them on her slides later, where we offered £1 million to 10 suppliers around them coming forward, and we did try and focus a lot on small suppliers as well, because again, trying to support suppliers to become net zero, to look at their products, to help them to achieve net zero going forward. Because when we start to think about the scale, I mean, we talked about the 80,000 suppliers, you know, we've got more than 500,000 products that the NHS buys. To be net zero, we will need to see changes in all of those products without compromising patient care. So big ambition, big goals, and when Pia spoke about some of the financial challenges as well, we need to still achieve net zero on top of that.
So, I mean, I guess back at the sort of sharp end at a trust level, you know, this is an increasingly focused agenda at a trust level. Or not all trusts, but many trusts have worked towards putting in place a green plan. At UCLH, we have, you may have seen, we declared a climate emergency at UCLH, and our commitment to achieving sustainability and working towards the net zero goals. I think and we've got some great examples at UCLH of where we have adopted sustainable solutions. We've implemented LED lighting, which is sort of, you know, not particularly sort of sexy and exciting, but we have also worked very closely with our anaesthetic colleagues to implement IV anaesthesia instead of gas-based inhalation anaesthesia. Yeah. And we've committed to not using desflurane by the end of this year, and I think we're very much on track to achieve that. Mm-hmm. Now, we invested in some IV pumps to approach the alternative of IV anaesthesia, and there's a real passion within the clinical team to look at adopting sustainable solutions, particularly from anaesthetists. Yeah. And you know, that commitment across the organisation is a strong one. I suppose you know, we haven't cracked it though, I think is the absolute truth of the matter. And we can't crack it until industry makes some significant leaps forward. And by that, what I mean is that when we come to procuring something, whatever that may be, I would like to be able to articulate and demonstrate to the trust, you can have this and its carbon impact is, you know, whatever the measure is, or you can have that and the carbon impact is, you know, something else. You know, what is the choice that we're making? And, you know, these, you know, we're not in a place where we have that data available to us, and, you know, we have to work pretty hard to understand what the carbon impact is of products, and we simply are just not there yet. And really that's an ambition I would like to see from industry, that starts to work to say, well, actually, what is it that we would need to understand in order to sort of try to start to think about, well, what is it that we're looking at? Now, I have a passionate view that we should also be understanding our sort of downstream supply chains in far more detail than we do at the moment. You know, where are we across the NHS for things like, you know, anti-slavery, forced labour. You know, we've had some atrocious examples in supply chain, you know, problems, if you like. You know, the gloves industry was exposed quite significantly last year. And, you know, that shouldn't be able to sort of come to light. You know, we should have an understanding of what's happening in our downstream supply chains far more than we do at the moment. And really, from a supplier perspective, we would be wanting to be able to sort of test that and see demonstrable evidence of, you know, efficacy and sort of probity in supply chains. And unfortunately, we've seen some issues, not just in terms of sort of sustainability or social value issues, but there is, in my view, insufficient auditing of supply chains across industry. That has led to some significant problems that we have experienced as the buying, you know, on the buying side of things. And I could give some examples, but don't want to expose the suppliers. So, so, you know, it is a really key issue for us.
Okay, now I want to talk about the suppliers here, right? And looking at it from a supplier's perspective, I mean, Priya, you mentioned there you really want to encourage smaller suppliers and local suppliers to get involved with the NHS. But I think it's fair to say that doing business as a small supplier with an institution like the NHS could be really daunting. So, Jackie, I'll ask you first, actually. So what are the ambitions, the future ambitions for the commercial function to encourage those smaller suppliers to say, hey, yes, we're the NHS, we're this behemoth, and but we are actually looking for suppliers like you to come and work with us?
So we're being very deliberate about that. We have been for quite a while, and we'll continue with our sort of SME programs, and it's something we want to, again, you know, now we've just come out of the last 2 years, these are the things that we can put renewed focus on in terms of how we engage, how we do that stakeholder management with our SME audience, our SME suppliers. And there's a couple of really key things. So innovation, you usually find that the best innovation or brilliant innovation comes through SMEs, always does. You know, the particular, could be a firm of 20 people that have created a group of scientists, whether it be in medicines, whether it be in medical devices, whatever it is, they've created something. And that's, I would say, where the majority of our SME suppliers are in that innovation area. We've got lots of areas in the NHS that open out. We've got lots of schemes. So I guess the question is, do people know about it? Are we being open enough? Because there are quite a few pathways in. Priya, you probably be able to explain the pathways better than I can. But there are quite a few initiatives, isn't there?
And especially where I mentioned around the social value, around sustainability, supporting specifically around SMEs, the roadmap that we have to achieve net zero, whilst we've got very clear targets, there's almost a 2-year grace period for SMEs as well. So again, a recognition from government that for SMEs to be able to change some of their products to support the journey around sustainability, we've included that as well. I mean, when we come back, I mean, there are targets, so every government department has a target around how much spend is through SMEs, and that is something that we're monitored on a monthly basis as well. So again, we need to be able to measure SMEs to be able to report that back to central government, as well as the procurement contract regulation, which is the regulation for all of our procurements. The rules within regulation is that where you can so instead of having one big tender and saying, we need one supplier for the whole of the NHS, what we are encouraged to do, again, is start to look at how can we break up some of that procurement to encourage a number of organisations to come together. And even where there is SMEs that come forward for procurement, again, how do we support them to collaborate? If the SME on its own couldn't provide that service, actually, how do we encourage and support that collaboration with other suppliers to come together? So a number of initiatives from a procurement side, but I agree, I think there's more we can still do. We've tried to start to streamline some of our tender documentation. You know, some of the really basics, you know, some of the tender documentation is really long and a number of suppliers pay for people to help them. So it's trying to see how we can reduce the costs for suppliers to be able to come into the NHS. Again, is some of the initiatives we're looking at the moment.
And of course the pipeline, what we were talking about earlier, where we start getting very open and transparent with our pipeline. That's a perfect way in, because people will see what we want to buy in the future, and that we're expecting to make significant inroads into our SME population.
Okay, and to reflect the theme of the conference here today, which is risk and resilience, by increasing the number of suppliers and using multiple smaller suppliers, you're obviously mitigating that risk and improving the resilience of your supply chain as well.
Yeah. I mean, part of where I mentioned the Boardman review and where Piers mentioned about having that full visibility around our supply chain is being able to understand all the way from, yes, the production of the final product, but actually what are all of the different levels in that supply chain to understand our risk. Because at the moment, yes, we've seen quite a lot of bumps in the supply chain, especially where there's prices going up, so inflation going up, where suppliers are starting to really feel it to say, actually there needs to be a little bit more give here in terms of some of the prices that we're willing to pay in the NHS. So this is where we're starting to really monitor a lot closer, so the financial status of our suppliers, around fragility, but also looking at what are some of the options that we have, that we aren't reliant just on a single supplier. So that's where some of the opportunities are coming through for other suppliers to be able to provide those same products to the NHS.
Okay, I mean, and that's something I've heard from other organisations or private organisations when it comes to supporting some of those smaller suppliers through these, turbulent times. Can you share any specific steps that you're taking? So, for instance, it might be on payment terms or things like that. You're helping to support some of those smaller suppliers.
Yeah, we're measured on a lot from government. I'll say. So how quickly we pay our suppliers, so not just within our own organisations, but also starting to look across the NHS. So there's normally 30-day payment terms. So as soon as we start to go over that, immediately within government, they start to question, to say, why haven't you paid this invoice that's come through? Again, there's a target around looking at our SMEs. So how quickly are we paying our SMEs to support them with cash flow? I mean, there isn't, unless there is a query about the value on the invoice, there isn't a reason why our processors shouldn't be able to pay those invoices in a really timely manner. So that's some of the work that we are monitored and encouraging.
Okay, Pia, turning to you now, what can suppliers do to support the NHS in driving this greater innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really critical, and it's a really critical point in time for us to sort of start to work and look for more innovative solutions across the NHS. As a procurement director, I would always say that working with procurement is, going to be incredibly important to that innovation approach. There does tend to be quite a focus on working with clinicians, none of which I find problematic, but that joining up with procurement to try and look at how we demonstrate that value to the organisation is always going to be, far more fruitful, if you like, in terms of that sort of relationship between us and industry. I think it's really important that, when we're thinking about innovation, well, what is that value proposition? Where is it demonstrating value and where in that sort of patient pathway, and what is the patient outcome going to be that is beneficial? Yeah. And, there's some fantastic examples across the NHS of where trusts have adopted innovations and driven that innovation. I would sort of hasten to add that's probably more likely to be in some of the larger organisations or some of the larger trusts across the system. But how industry works with us to build that sort of value proposition is absolutely key. I used to call it, getting to the UCLH number. How do you actually show, the cost to the organisation is where that cost is incurred, but there may be a benefit somewhere else. And there's some really nice examples of that. I remember speaking to suppliers many, many years ago about peripheral stenting, which the impact was, you undertake peripheral stenting in a leg for diabetes patients or something, but actually it reduces the incidence of lower limb amputation. Now, it's better for the patient, it's better for the system, there's better long-term implications for undertaking those procedures than there is for the alternative. And we've got to start working across primary care and secondary care to think about where those patient pathways are crossing borders. And, we really need to, that's something that we really need to work on. So, I invite and encourage, we're sort of starting to talk about it in the ICSs, where are innovations that don't necessarily, or they maybe commence in primary care, but they might have an impact in secondary care. And that's a whole different sort of conversation that we haven't necessarily been able to achieve to date. But, I think we're sort of certainly on a pathway to getting there.
Yeah, just if I may build on that a little, I mean, sort of that preventative innovation is what I've been so impressed with in terms of, it's all about preventative from a healthcare perspective, right, you say, right at that primary care level. And when I've been going out, so I've only been in this role from the 1st of January, which is why I turn to my very learned colleagues here for a lot of the detail. But one of the things I've done as the Chief Commercial Officer of the NHS, obviously, is I get out. And I've been going around all of the trusts. I've been going across the whole of the country, speaking to the commercial teams, speaking to the chief execs of the hospitals, speaking to the clinicians. And every time, without fail, I've gone out, somebody, usually in the commercial teams, have been able to show me about something brilliant. It might be just something small. It might be a new widget in a catheter. It could be, and it's absolutely fundamentally changing that patient pathway. What I always ask the question is, how are you sharing that? Because things are quite often done at trust level and ICS level, especially when they're the smaller hospitals. And we've got to, it's our responsibility to make sure that innovation, we put the right pathways, the processes in place so that we can actually share that across all of the trusts. We can actually say, look, what they're doing down in Southampton is brilliant, and you guys in Milton Keynes, I know you've got the same problem, and starting to put people together. And we see that very much as our commercial responsibility to do that.
Okay. Are there any questions from the floor before we move on to other questions I've got here? Any questions? No? Okay. Oh, yes. Could we get a microphone over there, please? If you just start by just saying your name and where you're from, please.
Hiya. My name's Anam. I am founder and CEO of Kavida AI. We help procurement teams get closer to suppliers to ensure on-time fulfillment of orders. Many of us will remember some of the headlines that were in the newspapers during the peak of COVID. Whether it was PPE shortages, certain drugs. Our core business is in risk and resiliency. I would love to know what were some of the biggest learnings going through that experience from you guys. I mean, being on the inside, dealing with all of that chaos. What were some of the biggest learnings that you gained? Yeah.
I think we could all answer that. Should we take it in turn?
Yeah, go on.
Certainly. Go first. I mean,
talk for hours.
To say I feel like I was at the sharp end of that would be the understatement of the century. But I think supply chain visibility was absolutely our Achilles heel, and the fact that we weren't mature enough in our own organisations to have that end-to-end visibility in the supply chain was something that was deeply problematic. So we were, in effect, having to do things manually every day. We were counting stuff every day. I was reliant on a team of people who, if I knew I had 5,000 gowns in the organisation and I'm working across, or we're supplying across 6 sites, I had to rely on the fact that my supply chain manager would know that I needed 300 over there, 200 over there, and 1,000 over there. And the sort of the lack of investment in the NHS in supply chain technology and supply chain visibility and supply chain intelligence is what has been probably the biggest learning that has come out of where we were in the midst of the pandemic. And we should be absolutely investing in supply chain resilience. We're running a program at UCLH which is trying to address our suboptimal just physical environment in which we're running stock and stock management. We've still got a long way to go in terms of just physical environment. And what that means is that we haven't had good stock visibility necessarily, even just from a physical perspective. But the kind of supply chain intelligence is my sort of my dream, to be able to understand my usage, my demand patterns, where my products are, what do I do if I needed to recall something. These are, still very much ambitions that are sitting on my whiteboard where I'm thinking one day we will get there. So supply chain visibility was 100%, our biggest challenge, and something that we should come out of the pandemic thinking this is a fundamental priority for us to fix across the system.
There was a few things that were going through my mind, reliving the the craziness of COVID. But I wanted to start a little bit on scale. So most of you today will stay in a London hotel because the conference carries on tomorrow. The NHS has more beds than all the hotel rooms in the whole of London. So when you start to think about the scale of the pandemic, and at the start of the pandemic, so most of our supply chain, we hold about 6 weeks worth of stock. What we also have at the moment is, because of EU exit, we also had an additional 6 weeks stock because we had sort of a central stock build. And then there was local stock reserves as well. An example that Pia gave around gowns is, I remember at the start, what the NHS spent on gowns, what we used on gowns in a month, we used in less than a week. And so suddenly our demand went absolutely through the roof. Completely agree with what Pia said. What we needed to know was how quickly were we using up our stock. We needed to know what every trust had on their site and how quickly they were running out in order for us to be able to fulfill that stock out to the NHS. We needed to know we had a process around mutual aid, because whilst we were focused very much on PPE, there are areas like trauma where our business as usual is that we will hold one of everything because there's so many products that you need. So we did need to understand what people had locally as well, that if we needed to share between trusts, we could do that. Coming back to our supply chain, so yes, lack of local visibility. Looking at our stock management systems, but we started to look at our supply chain as well. So when we started to look at, normally we would put things on a ship because actually we only needed it in 4 weeks' time, and so it was coming across. The usage levels, we now need to start looking at planes. We needed to look at flights. So again, our entire supply chain changed on that. But also the way the market behaved, the rules of the market were just completely out the window. We had, I started describing, I know this is being filmed, but I started describing other countries as our competitors. So it was completely different because actually we were all looking at the same supply chain. But I think technology was our biggest thing, is actually understanding our supply chain, understanding the fragility of our supply chain, having that visibility around stock, having that visibility around usage, and then also all the way to distribution. And that's probably, it's still a lesson we're learning. There's still a lot of investment that we need to do in that area. And also, how can we replenish? So, a lot of it is still manual, where people are placing orders. How can we go into auto replenishment? How can we start to really understand what are the different demands across each one of the hospitals to be able to fulfill that? So yes, I thought I'd start with a bit of context to see in terms of really the size and scale of the NHS, but also the challenge that we had to face. I had the real privilege of leading the procurement of the London Nightingale, and that was a 4,000 bedded unit in 9 days. I mean, honestly, where do you start? Where do you start with? I have photos on my phone afterwards if you want to have a look. From a blank warehouse in the Excel Centre to a state-of-the-art hospital, to achieve things like that, actually understanding our supply chain and the supply chain reacting as quickly as we'd need was really an amazing experience, and a big thank you to all of our suppliers on the way that they responded as well.
And I'll just go from a slightly different angle, which is lessons learned for the NHS from the pandemic is very much around how we got things done and the speed and of what that we got things done, but still in a compliant way. Yeah. Of course, we can have a whole conversation around that, but fundamentally in a compliant way, because we are still accountable for every penny that we spend, and will continue to be accountable. We've got public inquiries, etc. So really, we were able to act in a very, very agile. It was, having been in government for 6 years or so, it was amazing to watch how the machine worked and how quick we were able to do things. Yeah. And so I'm particularly passionate about not losing that. if we go back to, well, it takes a year to buy something, what a waste. What a waste of that experience. We've got to be able to do things faster, quicker, more effectively, embrace technology. We really embrace technology through the pandemic. So again, we could talk about this for a long time, but if anyone's particularly interested, if you haven't read it already, there is a published report, the Boardman report, that the Prime Minister commissioned about sort of 6 or 7 months ago to look specifically into commercial and procurement during the pandemic. It does cover ventilators, PPE, vaccines, My World of Test and Trace. It's published, it's on .gov.uk. So if anyone's really interested in that kind of the lessons learned and what we did well and what we didn't do, there's a brilliant published document that I would encourage you all to have a look at.
Okay, and just to wrap things up, because we are running out of time here, Pia, just some closing thoughts from you on what you want people to take away from this session.
I think that the pandemic has shone the light on procurement in the NHS, and I don't think I've seen, and I don't think we will see collectively, the types of supply chain challenges that we have seen in the last 2 years or so. We will never see them ever again. We've had a fuel crisis, we've had a cargo ship stuck in the Suez Canal, we've had a CO2 crisis, we've got a war, we've had a pandemic. It has absolutely fundamentally focused the need to have expert supply chain folk in the NHS, supply chain and procurement folk in the NHS, and we are absolutely needing to work with industry to meet our challenges in terms of, continuing to grow and develop what we offer at a trust level, and also to address some of the sort of systemic and strategic challenges around net zero, but also in terms of how we continue to deliver high quality, consistent and equitable patient care across the whole of the NHS. And we can only do that if we work with industry and we deliver that with patients in mind.
Yeah.
And Priya?
I think the session today was really recognising the challenge for suppliers to be able to come and work with the NHS and the routes into the NHS. We are trying to be more transparent. We're trying to show a lot more in terms of our forward thinking, so suppliers are aware of the things that we're going to buy and also how we're going to buy them. So again, it's one, we want to hear feedback from suppliers if there's more that we can do to support suppliers around streamlining our processes. And I have to also mention around the net zero and social value. That is a significant ambition for the NHS. We want to lead the way. We want to lead the way for across health, across the entire world. And so really working with suppliers around how we can not only improve our patient care using those products, but also around supporting the environment as well.
And Jackie?
I'll just finish by saying, I am incredibly privileged and incredibly honoured to be in the position that I'm in as Chief Commercial Officer of the NHS. What a job, what a responsibility when you look at not only the size and the scale, but just the impact on every single one of our lives and our families' lives. It's very serious what we do, and I bring that to work every single day, and the gravity of the decisions that this panel makes and our teams make is something that, as I say, I just want people to know it is taken incredibly seriously. We are incredibly focused, and to work with industry, work with our suppliers, that's got to be the way forward. So we are ready to talk whenever people wish to. Thank you.
Okay, there you go. Okay, please show your appreciation for our panel, Pia, Priya and Jackie.
Cool. Thank you.